This quiet piece of Wyoming was once one of the most contested pieces of real estate in American history. For travelers traveling along the Oregon Trail, it was a symbol of survival. For Mormons, it was a battleground for their faith. And for the United States Army, it was a foothold in controlling the American West. All three dreams collided right here. Before pioneers came west with their wagons, rugged men came west with their wits. I'm talking about the mountain men. In the 1820s and 1830s, mountain men roamed the west in search of beaver, and beaver pelts were highly prized for the fashion industry back east and in Europe. And one of those mountain men was Jim Bridger. By the late 1830s, the demand for beaver was dying out. Fickle fashionistas back east and in Europe just weren't as interested in them anymore. And so Jim Bridger and a fellow mountain man buddy of his named Pierre-Louis Vasquez recognized that the future of the American West lay with the thousands of people who were beginning to cross what would become the Oregon Trail. And so they set up a fort/trading post out here on the banks of the Black Fork River, the Green River, and the Oregon Trail. People traveled months to reach this point. They had heard of Jim Bridger and his fort, and they were looking forward to be able to rest and recuperate and feed their livestock and repair their wagons in the safety of a fort. When they finally got here, this is what they saw. Some people were really happy to reach this fort, and other people were like, it is what it is, and it ain't much. Regardless of what you thought of the fort, it was an important trading post. If you were a pioneer crossing the trail, chances are something in your wagon would break and you would need some blacksmithing done. You could get that done here. The blacksmith shop was over there in that corner. The other side of the building was the trading post, and there were some people who complained about the exorbitant prices that Messrs. Vasquez and Bridger charged for simple things like matches and even a drink of whiskey, both of which cost about 25 cents a piece. And then over on this side, you've got living quarters, examples of wagon pieces that were repaired, could be sold. And then over here off the side of the fort was a corral for horses. You could trade horses, buy oxen here. The fort was also a very important economic spot for the Utes, the Cheyenne, the Shoshone, and other tribes where they could trade with Bridger and Vasquez or immigrants as they traveled through. In the summer of 1846, a certain wagon train rolled up called the Donner Reed Party. They stopped here, they traded with Vasquez and Bridger, they traded for some oxen, and they also met a man named Lansford Hastings. And Lansford Hastings had just taken an immigrant train across a new cutoff that he'd found that goes across what's modern-day Utah and northern Nevada. And he convinced the Donner Reed Party to take his new cutoff to get to California faster. And so at the end of July 1846, the Donner Reed Party set off from this point and into history. So a year after the Donner Party rolled through here, a new group of people arrived, and that's the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, commonly called the Mormons. And they met Jim Bridger here, and they told him of their plans to settle in the Salt Lake Valley. Jim Bridger kind of scoffed at that idea and said that he would give anybody $1,000 if they could grow a bushel of corn in that valley. Now, the Latter-day Saints, of course, did go to the Salt Lake Valley and establish a community that exists today. And in 1848, under the Treaty of Guadalupe, the United States and Mexico made peace, and all of this land was ceded from Mexico to the United States. And this became the territory of Utah, with Brigham Young, the leader of the LDS Church, as territorial governor. So Fort Bridger was in the territory of Utah under the technical control of Brigham Young. Now, the fort that we just saw is actually a replica fort, but it's just a few hundred yards from where the original fort was, and we'll go see that now. But one of the cool things that they've done here is they've lit a fire in the fireplace in the trading post. And I think that's wonderful. I mean, what it does is it adds a sensory depth to history that you wouldn't normally get. The relationship between Fort Bridger and Salt Lake City ran smooth enough between 1848 and 1853. And in 1853, there was some trouble between the Latter-day Saints and the Utes, who began fighting. Now, Jim Bridger, he wasn't afraid to trade with anybody who'd make a good deal, and so he traded alcohol and ammunition with the Utes, both of which were prohibited by federal law. And so Brigham Young saw this as a problem and sent a party of 48 men up from the militia to arrest Jim Bridger. But before they could get here, Jim Bridger was made aware of their approach and so escaped. And after that, the LDS Church took temporary control of Fort Bridger. After the LDS Church purchased Fort Bridger for $8,000, they immediately went about improving the fort. And one of the improvements they made was constructing a stone wall, which is here behind me. And here's a picture of what the wall looked like when it was more intact. It was 15 foot high and 5 foot wide. So this is the remaining fort wall here, called the Mormon wall. And this is the original site of the fort. And so the wall came around here. Now, this foundation was for a later U.S. Army building. In fact, the rest of these are from the later U.S. Army occupation. But moving over here, we can pick up the remnants of the Mormon wall. Looks like they're doing an archaeological dig down here, which is cool. And it follows into here where they've done some more excavation. We'll go have a look at that. So this is really neat in showing the different layers of Euro-American occupation here at Fort Bridger. It is an archaeological excavation. It seems to be ongoing more or less. But obviously what we're looking at is building foundations. Now, the big building foundations here are from later U.S. Army occupation. But up here in the middle of the screen, you see a cut right there. That's a foundation cut for logs from Fort Bridger, from the original 1843 site. And then just beyond that, up here on the far side, you see the width of the cobblestone Mormon wall. So here we have the Mormon occupation, the original Fort Bridger site, and then the U.S. Army occupation. Back in 1857, things between the LDS Church and the federal government were really starting to pop off. The U.S. government wasn't terribly excited that a church had such a great amount of control over civil affairs, and so they sent out some judges to assert federal authority over civil affairs. Well, these judges weren't happy to be in Utah, which was really remote at the time, and they weren't happy to be living around polygamists, who in their eyes were hugely immoral. And so bad blood between these judges and the Latter-day Saints was inevitable. The judges end up going back to Washington, D.C. They say the Mormons are in rebellion. Brigham Young has whipped them up against them. We need to do something about it. And so the U.S. government sends 2,500 troops out to Utah to bring Brigham Young to heel. And 2,500 troops at that time was a considerable part of the U.S. Army. And so as the United States Army approached this part of the territory, the LDS Church sent out its militia, the Nauvoo Legion, to harass the army. Now, they weren't out to kill soldiers, but they wanted to make their life as miserable as possible. And so they did that by driving off their cattle, burning their wagons, burning the grassland, making it as difficult for the U.S. Army to reach Salt Lake as possible. So by this time, they had fortified Fort Bridger here, but the U.S. Army was bringing cannon, and it quickly became clear to the Latter-day Saints that their stone walls would be no match for this cannon. So as the Army approached Fort Bridger, they decided they would rather burn it all than just give it over to the Army. And so they torched Fort Bridger, burning it all to the ground except for the walls. And they didn't just burn the fort, they burned miles and miles of grassland around here, so the U.S. Army would find no comfort or refuge here. So I've traveled about 10 miles away from Fort Bridger to the site of another fort, Fort Supply. Now, after the Mishegoss of 1853, the LDS Church built Fort Supply here as a means of supplying Mormon immigrants as they were coming into the Utah Territory. And they wanted to undercut Jim Bridger's operation a little bit because he had been a pain in the neck. Based on that unprepossessing monument that we just saw, you wouldn't think that there's much left of the fort. But there is more than you think, and it's right here behind me. So this is on private property, and I serendipitously met one of the owners and got permission for this. But this is part of the old fort wall. So you can see a stump here, and then a stump here. And if you look, you can see some of the burn marks. This fort was burned at the same time the Mormons burnt Fort Bridger. And so you can see traces of that here still in the wood. Now, if we look down the line here, or what was the line, you can see there are more stumps in the field. And it's going to be really hard to see this on camera, but looking across the field here, you see yet more stumps. So the stumps go up here, and then they come across here. The walls of the fort were made out of pine logs harvested locally. And what they did was they dug holes 6 feet deep, stood the poles on end, and that made it so that the height of the wall was 12 feet. And they did that for hundreds and hundreds of feet here. It was a big fort. And again, like Fort Bridger, they burned this to the ground. So when the Army arrived here in the fall of 1857, it was early November, and they found very, very little forage for their animals. It was cold. It's cold now, and it's late September, and so they huddled up against one of the buttes or the mountains here and made the best for the winter. But it was a rough time. People got sick, animals died. It was anything but a good winter quarters for the U.S. Army. The Utah War ended peacefully in 1858. But what to do about Fort Bridger? The LDS Church said, hey, we paid $8,000 for that. We want it back. Jim Bridger, for his part, said, you know what, I really didn't mean to sell the fort, and I was duped, so I want it back. The U.S. government said, you know what, we took this by conquest, so we're going to hang on to it. And they created a 500-acre military reservation and reconstructed the fort into a new, top-of-the-line military installation. I think it's good to give you an idea of the scope and scale of the fort here. So, where these buildings are is the original site of Jim Bridger's fort. And on the other side, that's where you see the Mormon wall and the remnants. So these buildings were built right on top of that. This is the old guardhouse. That is the commissary. Now over here is where the infantry was housed. And I mean over here, as this fort was split into two halves. You had one half was a reserve for the officers and dragoons, and the other half was for the enlistment and the infantry. And so these logs mark where there were once buildings. So there were infantrymen's barracks through here, most of which are gone. Turning back over here, this is the main parade ground, and behind the trees is the flagpole, and then there were more infantrymen's barracks that surrounded the parade ground. And so this is only about half of the fort. And what's cool about this period is so much of what was here is here, and you can get a really good idea of what life was like for a U.S. infantryman between the 1860s and the 1890s when this closed. I think this is a neat look at the parade ground because we've got the flagpole there on the right side. Now the flagpole, when this was a fort, was actually a third of the height taller than it is now. So this is a shorter flagpole. Now what would happen is a bugler would climb up to the mast arm, stand up there and bugle so the sound could be heard all over the place. After the United States took control of this and made it a proper modern military fort, the role of the Army here shifted to protecting immigrants as they traveled across the Oregon and California trails, and to assert federal authority in the territories. Now, the Shoshone, of course, were not best pleased that their land was being encroached upon by foreigners, and so there was tensions, there was fighting, there was killing, there was all of that. In 1863, there was a treaty signed here at Fort Bridger that established a rough reservation with the Shoshone. It was signed by Chief Washakie. And then again in 1868, another treaty was signed in which more Shoshone land was ceded, and they created today what is the Wind River Reservation. So like the large infantry building behind us, this building was built in 1888, just a few years before the fort went out of use. And this is the newest guardhouse, which is the fort's jail, so to speak. And so let's take a look and see what it was like to be in jail while also being in the Army. So this is the central detention cell, or if you were just in trouble for a fairly minor crime, you would be housed in there with a number of people all in the same room. Fire buckets, rifles. Really, they've done such a good job at preserving this building and making it feel like it would have been in the past. The sign here says the beds are slanted to ensure that the guards would not fall asleep while on duty. So this room belonged to the duty officer in charge of operations here. So he had a bed that was not slanted, but let's have a look at the general detention cell. It's pitch black. So you just be hanging out in here with a bunch of other men. There's no windows. As you can see up top here, there are the iron bars for ventilation. And here in the corner, you can barely make it out, is your toilet, your piss bucket. And so I don't know if they had stools and tables, they might have done. But this was your general detention area. And what's kind of cool about this, I think anyway, is there's a catwalk. So the guards could walk around and make sure none of the inmates were trying to escape. And back behind are the special detention cells for extra naughty soldiers. One of them here is open. Great heavy door. And just a tiny, tiny cell. It's it's tall, and they don't have the same ventilation as the other inmates did. But there's ventilation enough, no doubt. I don't know if this sentry box is on its original location, but it sure is cool. It's cool to imagine A soldier standing at his post. They're inside that tiny little box in the middle of freezing weather. But what's also cool are more foundation stones for log barracks that were built starting in 1859. So do you know what would happen if a soldier was found with a missing button? Jail. Or do you know what would happen if a soldier crossed this bridge without permission? Straight to jail. This creek was the all-important dividing line between the enlisted men and the officers. Over here were the enlisted men. Over here were the officers. One of the things that I think lasts from when this was an active army fort to today is the difference between the enlisted men's part of the fort and the officers' part of the fort. The enlisted men's part of the fort has a very Spartan, no-nonsense like feel to it. I mean, there's not much left by way of buildings. But over on the officer's side of the fort, there's a lot that's left. You get a sense of the gentility, the civility that you could enjoy as an officer. After all, officers were also, by act of Congress, gentlemen. The officer side of the fort is also the location of one of the oldest buildings on the site. It dates back to 1858, and it's an officer's quarters. This is the last remaining example of the officer's quarters from 1858. Of course, it was updated over time, but as the sign says here, it pays to be an officer. You can have a look of what it looked like on Officers Row. But let's have a squiz at the inside. So the quarters are separated by this hallway, and on one side is an interpretation of an officer who would have served in the Civil War and had a higher rank and therefore had a more luxurious quarters. So this is the parlor. There's a poker game going on at the table, and in the back was where he slept. And over here on this side, we can actually go in this room. And this is interpretation of an officer who joined the Army after the Civil War, and so didn't have as much luxury afforded to him. Nevertheless, was able to live in some style. So this is a pretty substantial room. Nice cozy fireplace with a nice mantle. And back here was where they slept. And then the other side of the fireplace. And of course, being gentlemen, they were privileged to have servants. And like many of the great houses in the eastern US and in Europe, the servants were quartered in the back, where they lived and did their work. Now this is the officer's dining room. It's set out for a breakfast. And if you're wondering what that circle is in the wall, that was for a wood-burning stove. So you could connect a wood-burning stove and heat the room that way. Now, back in front of us is the kitchen, and off the doors off to the side here are where the servants slept. Now let's say you were an officer living here at Fort Bridger in the 1880s, and an officer of higher rank comes to visit the fort. Well, you could be kicked out of your bunk, so to speak, and that was something that was called getting ranked out. So the higher ranking officers always got the best quarters here at the fort. Built in 1844 and today looking a bit like a haunted mansion. This is the commanding officer's quarters. So he lived here with his family, and this is beautifully grand. Let's have a look inside. I forget what they call this style where you walk in and there's a main hallway with a stair upstairs and then rooms on either side. If you know, put that down in the comments. But they've done a magnificent job of decorating this to give you an idea of what it was like to be here in the 1880s. Over here, we have what looks like a ladies' sitting room, or a ladies' parlor. We've got instruments on the couch there on the right. We've got a teapot, books, and dominoes on the table in the center. We've got knitting, pictures, stuff that ladies of quality would have liked in the 1880s. So say there's a dinner here, ladies would have congregated and discussed ladylike things. Ah yes, this is cool. For fans of Downton Abbey, this will be very familiar. So you've got the dining room, which is laid out for a bit of a fancy dinner party. But you'll notice in the background there, it's about right there, there's a buffet where silverware was kept and dishes were placed out on top of it. And then we also have another fancier buffet over here on this side. And so servants could serve them pretty much like they would in Downton Abbey. Is where the men would have hung out. And a big clue is there on the table. You've got a gun, you've got a decanter, you've got a card game. On the wall, you've got a big buffalo skin with paintings of Native Americans and a buffalo hunt. A general on the wall. This is a more Spartan utilitarian room. This was the room where men would have come and smoked and drank and had a respectfully good time. Off the back of the house are the servants' quarters and the kitchen. So this is obviously the kitchen with a big stove and where a lot of work would have happened here. The food it did come right through and was served. For as old as they are, the stairs feel fairly sturdy. Looks like we've got perhaps the commandant's bedroom. Bedroom for guests or children. And then Mrs. Commandant's bedroom, which is pretty cool. I love the checkered fur blanket there. And that writing desk is really cool. But certainly very, very cozy, very comfortable. I'm not sure whose this room was. We do have a loom, a closet, a cupboard, wood-burning stove. But it probably wasn't a high-class room because we have the servants' quarters over here. So the servants' quarters were here on this side, and this is just an access corridor that goes down into the kitchen. Up over here you can access the main hall that's to the right of me. So fancy for its day, very class structured. One of the features that this house had was, here's the kitchen. If there was a fire in the kitchen, this part of the house was meant to kind of fall away from the rest of the house to preserve the big part of the house where the family lived. Pretty. Now there's a cemetery next to the grand old house here that is a great introduction into the next big story of the fort. And that's a cemetery for the family of William A. Carter. Carter came out here in 1857 with the U.S. Army. He stayed around as the fort sutler, and he's buried here with a bunch of other people that represent an interesting cross-section of modern human history here. This cemetery was made in 1933, and so all of the people here were reinterred. There with the big obelisk is, of course, William Alexander Carter, who died in 1881, so the fort was still active. Next to him are his wife and other relations. And over here is John Robertson, who was also known as Uncle Jack. He was a mountain man who was around when the fort was founded by Jim Bridger and Louis Vasquez, and he stayed around. Died in 1884. And then there on the far end is the grave of Virginia Bridger Hahn, who was the daughter of Jim Bridger and one of his wives. I think her mother was either a Ute or Shoshone, I think Ute. And so she was born July 4th, 1849 and died March 7th, 1933. So as I mentioned previously, William Carter came west with Johnston's army in 1857, and he stayed here at the fort, and in 1858 he became the fort sutler. The sutler was a civilian contractor that was licensed to sell non-ration goods to the U.S. Army and other people who were passing through. And so Sutler had a captive audience. He was essentially following in the footsteps of Jim Bridger, and he made a killing here. And so this building behind me and the buildings around it really are Carter's Preserve. He became Wyoming's first millionaire, and some say that he's the reason that Wyoming is square. So this is Wyoming's first schoolhouse, constructed by William Carter within his little compound here. It was built for his children and other children from the fort. The family brought in well-respected and educated teachers from the East to teach their children. And apparently, if you were a graduate of this school, you didn't have to take additional exams to go to other schools or universities back east. And what's kind of weird about this, at least to modern eyes, is side on with the schoolhouse is the milk house. This is great because it gives you an understanding of the scale of this, which was one of Carter's freight wagons. It's tall. I mean, it's probably 7.5 feet up to that edge. And it looks like a wooden tank almost. But these wheels are huge as well. They're probably 5.5 feet in diameter. But it's neat that this has survived. This is a grave that's right next to William Carter's preserve. And judging by the headstone there, you'd think this was the grave of a child or a human. But it's the grave of a dog. It's the grave of Thornburg, the dog. So according to the plaques, Thornburg was one of the few survivors from a Ute attack on a wagon train in 1879. And he was named Thornburg in honor of a major who was killed in that attack. He became a camp follower and just kind of hung around the fort until a freighter turned up named Buck Buchanan. And for whatever reason, Buck Buchanan got along with Thornburg so well that they became owner and dog, so to speak. And Thornburg was credited with a number of heroic acts like saving a boy from drowning, stopping a commissary thief, biting the arm of a man who was going to stab another man in a knife fight. So he was apparently a very well-respected dog. And he died when he was kicked by one of Buchanan's mules in 1888. And the grave behind us shows how much Buck Buchanan loved Thornburg. He actually purchased a headstone for him. Well, I'd like to thank you for joining me on this tour through the history of Fort Bridger. There's a lot more here than I expected there to be, and I gotta say, it's been a lot of fun. I look forward to coming back, and I would encourage anybody who can to stop and visit. It's, as you can see, it's more like a park today, and during the summer they have the buildings open so you can walk inside. I think they even host a rendezvous in late July or early August. So there's a lot that happens here and a lot of opportunity to check it out. So again, I'd like to thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.